So, on a scale of 1 to 10, how many of your colleagues hate you? No, I'm just kidding. Don't answer that. You don't have to answer that. Well, no, let me ask, staying on the academy for a minute. Do you think that, I mean, do you think that the academy, as it's structured in the United States, is in any way an incubator for ideas that shift the status quo? And if you don't, or even if you do you think at any point it used to be more so?
The U.S. Academy has always been very hooked into imperialist interests. There's been, if you look at the history of the national security state, a lot of the OSS that became the CIA came out of the Ivy League universities. And so the idea that there was kind of a golden age of universities, if you go back to the 40s or 50s and 60s, but you could also go back to the 30s or go back to the 19th century and all the support for slavery and eugenics and other such things that you find in the university. There wasn't a golden age of the American university, but there were certainly moments where there was a much more kind of radical vein to some research that was being done, right? In the 1930s, you do find that, and in the 60s and 70s, you do find some of that around the New Left stuff and whatnot. It usually still remains somewhat marginal. The university is an interesting site because I think it's also, and I'd be curious if you have thoughts on this regarding journalism and the mass media, because one of the things that's kind of interesting is it's caught in a little bit of a contradiction, because the way the university and the media presents itself is we're free and everybody's equal and it's just an ivory tower where all ideas matter, et cetera. When in fact, these are major corporations that are in bed with imperial and pro-corporate interests in very profound ways. Like the Avril Haines, who's taking over the CIA, she was working at Columbia University. There's not just a rotating door between the university and the national security state. There are operatives who basically inhabit both locations more or less at the same time. And so, but given the fact that the university and the mass media presents itself in this way, there's a really interesting contradiction where at times they have to allow for an autonomy of ideas that would give a platform to people like me or people like you or kind of alternative voices, trying to contain it within certain limits so that they're not featuring me on CNN right now, right? Or I'm not on the New York. I've published a little bit of stuff in the New York Times, but they've rejected a number of articles that had to do with the CIA. And so they give this little margin of maneuver. And I think it's really important for people like us to use that margin of maneuver, because it's a contradiction between the real social function of these institutions, which is to reproduce inequality and spread the dominant ideology, and how they present themselves to the public, which is free and open and everybody has free speech and things like this. And so within that margin of maneuver, we can do certain things. But my own work is not just invested in doing what you can do with extant institutions, but also developing counter institutions, educationally, at the level of media platforms and whatnot as well. Because I think that the kind of, to echo what you were saying earlier, if you want a nicer, greener capitalism, or do you want a socioeconomic system that people decide on their own? And so I'm very invested in popular education, and platforms and projects that do these types of popular education that aren't beholden to creating hierarchies within the classroom and to doing the kind of social triage of sorting out who's going to be the next members of the professional managerial class and who's going to be sent to work in a factory or work in gig labor or other such things. And so in my own work, I have a kind of two-prong approach. Do what you can within the margins of the institutions, but don't have any illusions about the institutions, because we also have to build power outside of the institutions from a kind of bottom-up grassroots perspective.
I like that. And since you touched on this in your answer, I got to ask, what are some of the things you submitted to the New York Times that they wouldn't publish?
So I got hooked into, I did a few pieces with the Times, and they have this opinion section where philosophers will write and do kind of public intellectual work. And so I did one or two pieces, and they circulated, but they were more personal and existential and a little bit less political. And then I did a piece on the CIA reads French theory, and it explored the way in which the national security state had a vested interest in kind of postmodern theory coming out of France, knowing what it was, what its social function was, and then also supporting it in quite concrete ways. And so I sent that to the Times thinking, well, I wrote these other pieces and kind of got my foot in the door. And one of the pieces kind of went viral a little bit and got translated into a lot of languages. So I figure, they want clicks and stuff because they're looking for their advertising base. And so can I make that contradiction work for myself? But that didn't work.
What were the theories? Like go into detail on that. Like what were some of the theories that they were subscribing to?
The CIA?
The CIA, yeah.
Yeah, so the CIA and actually I ended up publishing that particular piece in the Philosophical Salon, which is on the LA Review of Books, if people want to check it out. The CIA had a vested interest in moving the Western intelligentsia away from communism and to positions that they refer to as the non-communist left. And so they were funding journals, publication platforms, conferences, translations, and they were pouring tons of money into enormous international conferences with literally tens of thousands of people attending the conference, and not just academic conferences. These were conferences that were getting written up in like Time and Life magazine and things like this. And they were all basically anti-communist propaganda. And they were aiming to, as I say, kind of edge the Western intelligentsia away from communism and towards what's interesting in the case of Europe is they targeted socialists, but reformist socialists who weren't revolutionary socialists. And the CIA was going behind the back of Congress because they knew that the kind of, anti-communist Congress would not have supported the US government giving funding to socialist platforms. But the CIA, and these are, smart people who are trained in the Ivy Leagues, and not that being trained in the Ivy Leagues necessarily makes you smart, but what I mean by that is they're like serious operators and they're not fucking around when they want to get something done. And they understood that the best way to do this was you divide the left, right? And you sever off the anti-capitalist left from the pro-capitalist left, or at least from the reformist left. And that's a gradual process. And so if you can at least get rid of the communists to start with, then little by little, you can move further and further to the right. And that's what we've seen over time, right? In the post-war era, in Europe, almost all of the visible intellectuals were Marxists because all of the fascists and all of the liberals who had collaborated with fascists looked pretty bad after all of the information about the concentration camps came out. And so if you wanted to be anyone with a little bit of street cred, you were open to Marxism. But then the postmodern theory that rose to prominence in the 60s and 70s was largely anti-Marxist. And that was exactly in line with the interests of the US national security state. And they were not only anti-Marxist, they were not critical of American foreign policy and American imperialism, whereas of course the Marxists were. And so driving that wedge into the intelligentsia was really significant. And the fact that then French theory would be imported into the United States as the most cutting edge and radical theory ever invented is a big part of this project. And it's not just the national security state that did this, it's the major corporations and the foundations that backed a lot of these projects. So when postmodern theory arrived in the United States, many people point to the 1966 conference that took place at Johns Hopkins with, if your viewers or listeners know people like Derrida and Lacan and the kind of famous postmodern theorists, they were all invited to this conference, and it was funded by the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation gave a ton of money to this particular conference and then follow-up seminars and whatnot. And so this was an importation of French theory that was anti-Marxist. They didn't invite any of the Marxists or any of the real Marxists. And this was part of an intellectual world war, quite explicitly so. And the Ford Foundation, of course, worked hand in glove with the national security state. So you shouldn't think that, oh, this was private and then the CIA work was different. You look at the history of the Ford Foundation and tons of these people were also working for the national security state, just as the same is the case with the Rockefeller Foundation, with the Carnegie Foundation. This is the big leagues of the corporatocracy. And the CIA is in bed with all of these people. They work for these people. And so all of that story, of which there are many other components, is what goes on into this project that I mentioned, the intellectual world war that I've been working on. And it really explains why, I shouldn't be, I'm not exactly a voice in the desert, so to speak. There are lots of other kind of more progressive academics that are out there, fortunately, but I should be one of thousands and thousands, but I certainly don't feel like I am one of thousands and thousands.
I can't believe the New York Times wouldn't want to publish such a thing. That sounds right up their alley. When I mean, the one of the outlets that helped lie us into the Iraq War, I can't believe they would want to publish such a thing.
Well, actually, could I get a dig in on the Times while we're talking about it really quick?
Of course.
So the Times, the director of the New York Times from 1935 to 1961, right? This is decades, was Arthur Hayes Salzberger, and he signed a confidentiality agreement with the CIA, which is the closest, it's the highest level of collaboration that a news outlet can have, meaning that he had regular confidential conversations with the CIA about the stories they were running, what they were going to run, how they were going to toe the CIA line, etc. And so the history of the corporate or the mass media in the United States and its ties to the national security state is deep and very, very dark. There's a great article by Carl Bernstein that goes into some of this. There's the Church Committee report that goes into it. I mean, the CIA uses tons of journalists as operatives, like literally hundreds and hundreds of journalists, both domestically and internationally. Who's the guy on the pretty boy, older gray fox guy on CNN? What's his name again? You know who I'm talking about, right?
Yeah,
Anderson Cooper.
Know. Yeah, Anderson Cooper.
Yeah, he interned with the CIA like 2 summers in a row or something like that. Like, I might be wrong about the details, but he has CIA connections. Like, This is how that world works, and people need to know that.
Well, I mean, I think, and I'm not recalling names off the top of my head either, because I don't watch cable news all that often. But I know MSNBC, they're doing similar stuff too, and they're bragging about it. They're like proud of it. They're like, these are our defense experts. These are like, yeah, these are people that are just like stenographers for the CIA, and you're just having them on and you're calling it news, and this is very not okay. There is nothing okay about any of this.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together and make it our own. Get your